Hello and welcome back to the IPA's Looking Forward, a weekly podcast of debate and discussion about politics and ideas. We've got big questions this week. Is Extinction Rebellion giving protest a bad name? And do we need tougher laws? Is there a cultural cringe at our universities? And is that why they're killing off Australian history? And has ScoMo caught the enquiry disease and become a do-nothing PM? As he might say, we'll look into it. And I can't wait for our books and culture segment today. We'll be looking at the winners of the Nobel Prize for economics and the tremendous work they've done to alleviate poverty, a work of political economy on the so-called populist revolt, a new book the bank bashers will love, and some classic Stephen King. I'm Scott Hargreaves, editor of the IPA Review, joined today by my co-host from RMIT University, Dr. Chris Berg.
G'day, Scott.
Also in the studio with us is the IPA's Director of Policy, Gideon Rozner.
Good morning.
And the National Manager of Generation Liberty, Renee Gorman.
Thanks for having me on.
Great to have you back. Don't forget this podcast is brought to you by the Institute of Public Affairs. If you're not already a member, please do go to ipa.org.au where you can join or donate anytime you like. And if you're on the app, listening to us on the app, this is your chance to give us a review. Even before you've heard the show, just 5 stars. 5 stars is good. It all helps in the rankings. Now, as mentioned, for anyone who hasn't been living in a cave, last week's news was dominated by Extinction Rebellion and their actions across our major capital cities. We're going to talk about the wash-up of that and also some new laws that are being proposed to deal with protests and particularly Extinction Rebellion. Chris Berg.
That's right. So the Queensland Palaszczuk government is rushing through anti-protest laws in response specifically to the Extinction Rebellion climate protests, which, as you say, have been really most of the major capital cities in the country. These laws are very, very controversial, not just with the Extinction Rebellion protesters, and I thought it might be worth talking about this because talking about protest laws and the freedom or constraints on protest is actually, it turns out it's a theme of this podcast, Scott. So the laws in Queensland, they provide for potential jail sentences for up to 2 years for someone for disrupting transport or disrupting business. They have some increased search powers, but the most interesting one and the one that's been mostly focused on in this is it's targeting the use of protest devices and implements. So there are these things called sleeping dragons, and sleeping dragons are, as I understand them, not having been in many protests myself and certainly having chained myself to very few buildings, they involve handcuffs and PVC piping. The idea is that you handcuff yourself together. So let's say we handcuff together around this table. Normally the police would just be able to cut the handcuffs. But if you handcuff yourself through a PVC pipe, then the police don't know where to cut. And they're not going to cause you harm, then they're not going to damage you, so they can't just work at you with bolt cutters. On top of that, they might add concrete or wire mesh. Anyway, so these sorts of...
Apparently it then becomes called a dragon's den.
If you've got multiple of them, although I'm quite suspicious about that because I spent at least 10 minutes trying to Google Dragon's Den protest and the only thing that came up was the bill. Nonetheless.
I did the same thing. I Googled Dragon's Den and all I got was sort of fantasy novels and things like that.
Video games.
Yeah, Blizzard games and things like that.
But apart from the inherent interest of what is clearly innovation in protest movements, which is great to see. Gideon, what's your take on this legislation? From an outsider's perspective, does it look heavy-handed? Is this targeting a genuine problem? What do you think?
I never thought I would ever utter this sentence, but I think Anastasia Palaszczuk is actually showing leadership on this. I can understand why and that might be being a bit too generous, and I can understand why Queensland is the first cab off the rank because the Extinction Rebellion lunatics have been targeting Brisbane in particular. They brought the city to a standstill. In some ways, she doesn't really have much of a choice. I am suspicious of measures that are intended to wind back public protest. I'm suspicious especially of legislation which targets particular items which might otherwise be innocuous. You know, we have debates over should spray paint, the sale of spray paint, for example, be limited to crack down on graffiti. So instinctively I put this in the same basket, but my reading of the exposure draft of the bill to me says this is targeted and this is limited in a reasonable way. My reading of it is that the search powers for searching vehicles for these devices, for example, apply if there is a reasonable suspicion that a dangerous attachment device has been or will be used to disrupt a relevant lawful activity defined as interfering with transport, stopping somebody from entering or leaving a place of business, or halting the operation of plant and machinery. I think that's targeted enough to remove these devices, and to me it meets the trade-off between incursions on our liberty and to make sure that the right of people to protest doesn't impinge on the other right of other people to get to work, to go about their day, and to be free of serious economic damage. I mean, the protests in Melbourne cost $3 million for
something like
16,000
hours of police. And probably the only one that part of it and that pushes the boat out is, of course, the will be. That if you're having your possession implements that will be used for one of these protests.
A reasonable suspicion that they will be used.
Yes, it's a little bit like the anti-terror laws.
Hippies with PVC is reasonable suspicion in that story. Then.
Well, that's probably... I mean, I'm actually with you. I was hoping to get a disagreement going, but I'm actually agreeing with you. But I think that...
I'm a rival libertarian, but on some... on some... although this is in keeping with libertarianism, I mean, this is the classic... again, I make the point. You shouldn't... protesting fine, using accessing devices fine, but to use them to impinge on the rights of other people.
I think it also highlights that these particular protests don't really understand the point of protesting, as in demonstrations like this in the past, they knew they were going to get arrested, they expected to get arrested, and that was kind of the point, is that you created the story around there was such a police presence. And these new protesters of, I hate the term, but the snowflake generation is like, I'm going to block traffic, this is all about me, yeah. And then they get arrested like, oh my God, I can't believe I got arrested for blocking traffic.
To take the devil's advocate position, and I don't actually think I believe this, but nonetheless.
Someone has to do it.
Hasn't it?
That was a little bit boring podcast.
Yeah, but isn't it doing precisely what it is intended to do? In the sense that, so they want to block traffic to draw attention to the fact that there is a climate catastrophe. It is called Extinction Rebellion. It's a massive global protest. All these things are true. Massive global protest that we have talked about for weeks and weeks, in part because they're using tactics like, quote, the sleeping dragon or dragon's den. Isn't that a success from their measure of success? Isn't that a success?
Yeah, it comes down to what matters more to them. They have got their message across, but you have to be willing to take on the responsibility and the consequences of your actions.
Well, no, they don't, because they're trots. They don't.
Yeah, they don't.
And I made this point on Sky on Sunday night. People are saying, well, they should be able to recover the costs. These people have no money. What are you going to do? Seize their bongs and sell them at auction? But more to to your point, Chris, and this
which are illegal in Victoria, I have to say.
Oh well,
because you might use tobacco in them.
No, to your point, Chris, I actually read something on this. I can't remember some head of some environmental charity, surprise, but they said, look, people said the same thing about Occupy. The Occupy protesters a few years ago, people said, they're making a point about inequality, but they're not winning people over to their side because they're a nuisance and they're constructing shanty towns and everything else. Years later, all we hear about from the Democrats in particular in the US is inequality. The argument is that, people might go through a little bit of short-term irritation now, but eventually it'll stick, and then all we'll hear about, because we don't hear enough about it already, is climate change and the climate emergency.
Yeah, one of the things I want to focus on, though, and they are trots, and a lot of them were in Occupy,
trots is a technical term.
Yeah, so Daniel Andrews was saying, this doesn't help the environmental movement. The people who are organising Extinction Rebellion are not members of the environmental movement. They are actually they're trying to bring down capitalism, bring down the social order, initiate anarchy, heighten the contradictions, all the sorts of things that radicals like to do. And I actually think this is actually a disgrace what they're doing in terms of the measures that they're taking and the arrests that are being made. Because, as you say, Renee, traditionally what you do is you initiate some kind of an action, you have a sit-down or whatever, you might be thrown out of somewhere, you get arrested, but essentially these are for misdemeanours. Now, my local library, and if you go on their website, libraries all over the country are hosting Extinction Rebellion training sessions where No. Well, this is deadly serious because, and I've seen members of the environmental movement pointing this out, is that this is not about honourable protest activity. These are creating criminal records that could destroy people's life chances. Now, in Victoria, for instance, there's no new laws, but what has actually been triggered is not the usual sort of, refuse to comply with a lawful order to move on. It's there were new laws passed so that you can't interfere with the work of emergency workers. This was brought in because of assaults on paramedics and things. So you can go to jail for this. And this is what people are being charged under. And similarly with the Queensland laws, they're responding to a change in tactics, which is dangerous, certainly to the impressionable young people that are being encouraged to do outrageous things. And again, Palaszczuk has a point. The Honourable MT Ryan, forgive me for not knowing who that is, but the second reading speech is actually quite good, because also we've seen around some of the Adani protests, the mine protests, some very, very dangerous measures. If you go and concrete yourself to a railway line, you better be damn sure there isn't a train about to roll over that hill.
Yeah, I really agree, and kind of connecting to another topic, if I'm going to give it away, I was looking up Australian history topics at Sydney University, and there's only 3, and one of them is called "What Do We Want? Protest in Australia." And I do think that it comes down to you create other victims. So we've seen this with Antifa in America. So there was an incident where there was a speaker, I can't remember the name of the speaker, but it was a typical conservative speaker, no one completely outlandish. And Antifa rocked up. And what a lot of people don't realise is Antifa's made up of professional protesters, but also made up of kids who were stuck on the street, who are homeless, who were brought in, who were brainwashed, who were told, this is your family now. And this boy, convinced that this elderly Jewish man was in fact a Nazi, strangled him, he had a cardiac arrest, he almost died. He's now in jail for manslaughter, attempted murder. He's a victim as well.
So
is he? No.
Oh, no, I think they're both victims.
I see Renee's point. I see Renee's point.
We cannot.
This is exploitation.
It's exploitation.
We cannot excuse.
Not excusing what he did, but he's still a victim.
To a point. Well, is he? I don't think we can deprive these people of agency. I think that's a soft touch. I don't think we can look at these lunatics. Children maybe, but I don't know. I don't know about that. I want to put something else out though, because how do we feel about civil disobedience generally? I mean, the case I always go back to is Frank Penhaliak in Victoria, who during the 1980s refused to close his hardware store on a Sunday to protest the grave injustice of trading hour restrictions. Now, to my mind, that bloke is one of the greatest heroes in the history of the Commonwealth. Is it that he wasn't harming anybody else necessarily? Is it our subjective definition of what an unjust law is?
Yeah, so I'm embarrassed to say, this is a great question because
Is it a rule of law issue?
I'm kind of sympathetic to civil disobedience on things that I'm sympathetic to. And I unfortunately, if I'd known that you were going to ask that question, then I would have read the book. But Jason Brennan is a libertarian author and academic in the US, and he's got a new book called When All Else Fails, The Ethics of Resistance to State Injustice. And my understanding of his argument in that as well, in some circumstances, yes, you have to resist in an unjust state. And you have to do so by violating, those sorts of laws without, seriously harming other people's rights as well. So I can see environments in which that's the case.
But that's the
and
key
the most
sentence,
obvious,
without harming other people's rights.
Well, no, but it's not. But it's proportional harm. So So would we be opposed to doing so in Nazi Germany? No, you can't block a train in Nazi Germany.
Yeah.
Obviously, that's not the case, and so there's obviously a marginal choice. Now, I don't think that these actions rise to that sort of level. But it was interesting to see, and we should move on for this topic in a moment, but it was interesting to see on Friday there was a parliamentary committee hearing into these bills, and the union movement was very upset. Now, the union movement doesn't really use these sorts of tactics with their protest movements and so forth, and they don't traditionally try to tie themselves to things as the environmental protesters do. But they are very concerned that these laws are just so general that they
The
can be
Palaszczuk
used,
laws.
the Palaszczuk laws, that they can be used to prevent what they would see as more virtuous protest in that way.
The entering and leaving a building thing, I suppose.
And you do have to worry when you see these sorts of legislative changes being made for just one specific type of protester. How will they be applied to the next protest? How will they be applied to a protest against, say, something that we are sympathetic to, the lockout laws or something like that? But yeah, so I actually do worry about these quite a bit.
And that is wending its way through the Queensland Parliament, so we'll keep an eye on that one. Another thing we're keeping an eye on, and there is a Senate committee of inquiry into into nationhood, citizenship, what it means to be Australian under the chairmanship of the wonderful Amanda Stoker. We talked about that last week on the podcast. And some of the submissions are throwing up some interesting issues. The Australian has covered some submissions that we'll talk about in a moment that are saying that the nation's top universities are not interested in promoting the study of things that are Australian and are failing in their responsibilities as national institutions. Chris Berg, what's going on?
That's right. So one of our friends and an excellent scholar, Greg Malouche, he's a professor of history at the University of Wollongong, put in a really powerful submission, which, as you mentioned, got some media this week. He told the parliamentary inquiry that universities are, quote, primarily international in their loyalties, and that they are not interested in promoting the study of things Australian and are failing in their responsibilities as national institutions. Now, the reason for that, and this is something that I've actually personally experienced as well when I'm a young scholar and just trying to think, what am I going to study and what's the next paper I'm going to write and what's the next book I'm going to write? Well, what matters in academia is how highly ranked your publications are. So are you publishing in the top journals in the world? Are you publishing in the top 5, or are you publishing in an A-star journal, or are you just publishing down the rankings? And there are formal rankings in many fields that actually list, this is a good journal, this is a bad journal. Problem is that those top journals don't really rate Australian material very high. They're all American journals, almost uniformly American journals, some European, but almost uniformly American journals. And Americans are willing to publish American things, but if you try to give them Australian content, they'll be like, oh, that's sort of a regional niche interest.
Sorry, Dr. Gorman, but who is this Joseph Carruthers guy?
Exactly.
Why should I care?
Precisely.
What's the bunyip aristocracy?
So because academics aren't idiots, they respond to these incentives. So you make a decision to, instead of studying Australia and adding value back to Australia, you study international topics instead. And you study the sorts of things that will get into those top journals, then be part of your promotion document to become associate professor or what have you. And over time, we just end up having less and less scholarship into the things that matter for Australia. So this is the other side of the research that the IPA has done about the teaching. So the teaching of Australian topics and Australian history, there's a long tradition of research at the IPA into that. But this is about the research. People aren't researching in Australian history as well. And what Greg's done is tied that to, well, this is how we think of ourselves as a nation.
Is that all it is, though? Because I think you're being a bit soft on the universities. I don't think this is just
maybe I am.
that you can't
It's
get
not
published
everything,
in
but it's
journals.
not nothing.
I think it is. There is a anti-Australian feeling in universities. I went and researched the subjects that are available in Australian history at Melbourne University, Sydney University and Monash University, 3 of our biggest institutions. Melbourne University has controversies in Australian history, Australia in the world from 1914 to 2014, which makes a point of mentioning Pauline Hanson in the bio. City Visions, Melbourne Intensive, which I found out is a holiday program where you just get to walk through the city and get a pass.
Look at graffiti.
And then
I do that in my work hours.
and then
I did that in my uni degree too, but I never got any credit for it. Mostly between pubs.
There's a mixed subject, Australian Indigenous politics, which one of Theodora's friends attended and was told at the beginning of the class, as if you are not Indigenous, you're not allowed to have an opinion in this subject.
Well, there you go.
And Sydney
Sounds about
University has similarly, what do we want? Protest in Australia, Australian environmental history. And Monash, again, Australia Migrant Nation, Australia Black history. Every single one is something about how bad Australia is, a lot of it, like how we should be guilty.
That feeds into Chris's point, though, because if you are going to write something about Australian history, given the state of international scholarship, not just Australian scholarship, what's more likely to get a run? Some sort of nice pastoral piece about, Henry Parkes or something, or the Australian experience of white colonialism versus Indigenous. Those are universal themes in academic circles these days.
Yeah, but here's the thing. I think things have changed, and I think it. Something's going on when Greg Malouche, extremely solid academic. There's a unity ticket with Stuart McIntyre, who, we call.
Of Melbourne University?
Former head of the Faculty of Arts at Melbourne University and, erstwhile communist and historian. And he's from that generation that had a very left-wing interpretation of Australian history, but he was interested in Australian history as a thing. He wrote books which attempted to grapple with Australian history in its totality. We might have the IPA may have actually critiqued those books. I think it was on Berg's bookshelf for a long time, but then when say Bella de Brera wrote her audit of Australian history, which highlighted some of the subjects that Renee's talked about, you almost look back wistfully on someone of Stuart McIntyre's generation who was solidly left-wing, but who were actually interested in Australian history being a thing, whereas now it's disintegrating.
So that's what I call the Germaine Greer effect. It's just that today's lefties are so crazy. You look at somebody like Germaine Greer and say, actually, she is making a lot of sense.
But it's not just... So we focus on history because, obviously Stuart McIntyre and Greg Malouche are historians, but this is a problem across all the social science disciplines, certainly in my experience, that to study Australian specific things, to use specifically Australian data, to use Australian anecdotes in otherwise general research projects is actually counted against you because it's seen as regional. Now, I can understand why if you're sitting at a desk at Harvard University, you might think of Australia as regional, but that's because we're trying to market. The incentives of academia are encouraging ourselves to market ourselves to the person sitting in the desk at Harvard University. Now, how precisely the government's going to deal with this problem, because all academics think all reputation comes from being an American or certainly having international reputation, all that sort of thing, but it does create a serious problem that we pour a massive amount of money into research into Australian universities from a public policy perspective, and at the same time, people are disincentivized to study academia. Australia.
So, in my adventures with Peter Ridd, I met recently with a bloke from the Queensland branch of the National Tertiary Education Union, and obviously we didn't agree on a lot, but we did have very similar views on academic freedom, or at least the fact that it was a problem. And he explained to me that the phenomenon you are describing is actually having consequences for academic freedom as well, not just the content of courses, because increasingly academics who might want to write about something more localised, something more niche, something that might actually be useful to Australia and Australians are being railroaded into more generalist, highfalutin areas of study that will rank in the international journals, and this chasing of prestige and rankings and in turn funding and students and all sorts of other things is creating an environment in which academic freedom is being stifled. Now, I, being the free marketeer I am, would have no problems with rankings and everything else if universities were private institutions, but they're not. We are pouring billions of dollars into these organisations so that university administrators can engage in, frankly, empire building, competing against, I might add, institutions from overseas that are largely publicly funded themselves. It is competition with our money to perverse ends, and it's producing nothing useful for the nation.
It's actually connected to that. I'm actually not really... I wouldn't say I'm for the new measures the government was looking into funding at universities should be based on employment after universities. It sounds good on the surface, but all I feel like it's going to do, because it's just done on the university overall employment afterwards, it's just going to pour money back into the sandstone institutions, the prestige institutions, because that's what you're hired off. It's not how specific was your degree? It was Sydney University still has some of the highest employment ranks because you got into Sydney University, and it's just seen as that, not because the course was very effective.
Yeah.
So I'm actually very tentative about whether that will have the results that we
And worst of all,
wanted to
we'll
have.
create more law students. That's the last thing this country needs.
I'm
We have
reminded
too many as it is.
to roll back slightly a minute or so. I'm reminded of one of my favourite openings to a thesis, and this is a thesis from 1984 on Charters Towers, the city in Queensland, and it's a history of Charters Towers and contextualises Charters Towers in Queensland or North Queensland at the time. But the first sentence of the abstract is, the academic establishment has probably not been waiting anxiously for a PhD on Charters Towers. But it is important.
Yeah. So what do we do about this? Because, surely it must be within our, given that it is public funding, given that we do have this system through the ARC grants and other incentives for universities. I mean, what can we do?
So
what
the
should we
government,
do?
the government actually has started doing this, and this is last year there was the big kerfuffle about a whole bunch of ARC grants, Discovery Early Career Research grants, were denied by the Education Minister because they weren't seen as directly relevant to Australia, and some of them were on like native American populations and that sort of thing, and it wasn't clear that they were at all connected to the purpose of the Australian research funding system. And this got everybody very, very upset that they'd been denied, and the government responded by insisting that the ARC, the Australian Research Council, puts in a, quote, national benefit test. So now when you write a grant proposal to the Australian government, you have to demonstrate that it is of value to Australia, not just of intellectual interest or just general research value. Now, many of my academic colleagues are not a big fan of this new national benefit test. I think this is a really good idea for obvious reasons, and I would make some further changes to the ARC system as well. But it's that sort of thing that you could do. Now, that's a small thing, and most academics are not even going for ARC grants. But at the margin, we can start trying to direct all this money towards not national priorities, but national benefits.
I don't have any problem with the idea in theory, but do you really trust a bunch of bean counters from the Department of Education to appropriately adjudicate on what is of value to the country? Aren't we just going to end up with 50,000 more papers on climate change?
Yeah, look, that's absolutely right. So you've still got entrenched issues about the sort of stuff that they fund anyway, but to the extent that it can be helpful. And remember, the ultimate decision maker here is the minister. And the minister is an elected person. And the kerfuffle was all about the fact that the minister personally crossed off those names and crossed off those projects. I think we should insist on the ministers having some degree of responsibility for the sort of stuff that the government funds.
Hear, hear.
Do you think that there's also the problem of you can remove as many regulations as you want and put in systems to test subjects, but unless there's a cultural shift on campus on how we see Australia, like it's still going to be taught through the lens of identity politics, and we're all racist, and Australia's terrible. And is that really going to solve the problem in the end? I think, yes, it's not incentivized, but there's also a cultural problem about how they look at Australia at universities.
Yeah.
No, and that's an intellectual debate for us to have.
Well, they say it's a necessary but not a sufficient condition to achieve change.
Exactly.
We need both. And that's the work of a lifetime that you've just described there, Renee. So good luck achieving that cultural change.
So at least you'll be busy.
Now, I actually have a ready-made segue here, and I do love a good segue. The House of Representatives has a standing committee on employment, education and training has in fact been conducting an inquiry at the request of the Minister into how Australia's research is funded. I found out about this because there's featured in The Australian recently has been an astonishingly long list of reviews that the Morrison government has embarked upon or that are in progress. And there's been a bit of an accusation that they've become a bit review happy as an alternative to making decisions. And that's only one of them. Chris Berg, what do you make of this?
Yeah, they really have. So this was another big front page story this week. The government has initiated not just one, not just 10, but 72 inquiries since September 2018 and has come into some criticism for running reviews rather than actually making policy. And a more sophisticated version of that criticism is, well, in fact, what you're doing is handing a lot of policy decision-making over to the people who run the reviews, and you're relying on bureaucrats or regulators to actually start setting the agenda of your own government, which is a bit of a disaster. Now, the question that I will raise first for you, Gideon, the accusation has been made that this is a do-nothing government and this is evidence for a do-nothing government. Do you think that is unfair, or are we in a bit of a problem that the Conservative government can't act in a way that we would hope?
Look, I don't mind the idea of a do-nothing government. I mean, God, I'd like the best case scenario is a government that actually engages in meaningful reform, which the Morrison government, is on the track of doing. Red tape, and it's made noises about IR and all sorts of other things. I don't think this is any more review happy than the predecessor governments, to be honest. This is, as the point has been made, this is a trend in our governments, and it has been for a very long time. And there are a few reasons why you conduct a review. Firstly, as a covering of the proverbial, because then difficult decisions can be explained away on the basis that they were formulated after a long review process with many submissions and public consultation. A lot of the time it's to soften people up for a change to the law which is going to be harsh. So the review comes out recommending terribly draconian measures, and then the government decides to adopt 75% of it.
Do nothing.
So, or to take it, or best case scenario, to take a softer line. The other, and this is particularly relevant this week, the other function of review that I've noticed lately, which is the worst and most egregious kind, is as a blatantly political device. Look at the review that's been announced into, love Josh to death, but the review that's been announced...
Josh Frydenberg, Treasurer of Australia.
Yes, the Treasurer of the Commonwealth. He has announced a review by the ACCC into banks passing on interest rates. Now, this is an extension of the pantomime we see every time rates are lowered. It's like clockwork. The rates will be lowered. The guessing game will start as to whether the banks will follow. One or two don't. The Treasurer huffs and puffs and says, this is unacceptable. You have to stop ripping off Australians. And then everybody forgets about it. This is an extension to that, where there's actually an inquiry in place trying to work it out. But even if there's an inquiry, what are the recommendations going to be? That the government legislate to force them to pass on the rate cut? Are we really in the territory of arguing for price controls on the cost of borrowing?
Guess what, Gideon? We are.
Correct. Anyway, that's a very off-track way of saying that this is just it's basically virtue signalling, and to do that at great public expense, I think, is pretty unconscionable. So, yeah, look, we do conduct too many reviews, and why we conduct the reviews we have to look at as well.
So, I will bring in the other interesting thing that happened this week was the release of the government's talking points, or the accidental emailing of the government's talking points. Very quickly, what are talking points, Gideon?
Yep.
Can you just talk us through what they are, and then I'll introduce what they actually were?
Okay, so talking points, broadly speaking, are a series of typically bullet points that explain the points to talk to, and are designed to keep people who are fronting the media and everything else on message.
Where do they come from?
These particular ones that we'll release this week come from the Prime Minister's office, and it's a stupid story in a way, because they go to everybody. They go to every not only every backbencher, but every staff member of every backbencher. So they're easily leakable. So we're not talking about state secrets.
No, and definitionally they're talking points. So you're supposed to say them.
But the purpose of them is, and this is what people need to understand. The purpose of them is we live in an era of 24-hour media cycles, Twitter and all the rest. If somebody says something that it diverges even a skerrick from the government's message, that's all you hear about for the next 24 hours. So if you have the Assistant Minister for God knows what going on regional radio at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, a little bit tired, and doesn't know the answer to a question on Gladys Liu or on ACCC or anything else, and says something that diverges from what the government line is, that becomes a headache for the government. So to keep everybody on message, these talking points, which the Labor Party send out as well every day, even in opposition, are necessary from the point of view of keeping, for the government's point. For us, it's frustrating because we get, 151 MPs talking off a song sheet.
Well, let me tell you what I learned from the government's talking points. To go into the do-nothing government. And I just want to emphasise, Gideon, that this is a Conservative government. I just want everybody to have a Conservative government in their head. They have an agenda. What is their agenda?
A plan.
Thank you. Well, the plan, but the agenda. I'm going to call it an agenda because I don't believe it's a plan. Their agenda, number 1, outlawing uncompetitive practices from big energy companies, delivering lower prices for Australian ferries. This is the, quote, big stick legislation, which I love. Yep. Ensuring multinationals pay their fair share of tax.
Fair share.
That's good. Stopping abuse of workers' entitlements by unions or employers. Preventing misuse of welfare and helping more Australians into jobs.
It's sounding more and more like utopia every day.
And preventing child exploitation with new mandatory sentencing laws for offenders. Now,
by which I mean the ABC program, not the actual utopia.
Some of these are, not virtuous ideas. But does that look like an agenda for a Conservative government, Renee?
No.
It's better than the previous
Do you want the
Conservative
short
government
answer
we
or the
had.
long answer?
But isn't this a problem?
Yeah, I definitely think it is a problem. And I think it is. It also smacks of what has been a consistent problem for Conservatives or Liberals in government for many terms. And it has been that they refuse to engage in cultural issues. They refuse to engage in cultural issues that could cause some controversy. And they would much rather just do a review into the matter than actually have any strong platform on anything like that.
But I think it's worse than that. I think it's it doesn't strike me that there are any ideas there.
Yeah, well,
no, there is no ideas.
Well, let's go back to the list and counterfactual. I was just thinking, imagine if you did this as a counterfactual instead of saying a review. For instance, so they flicked to the Productivity Commission a review of resources legislation and its negative impacts on investment in Australia. Review of resources regulation, Productivity Commission inquiry. There's been like 100 inquiries on this over the years. Imagine if instead of a review, they had have actually done something. They had have just introduced the bill to reduce the red tape that is holding back the resources sector and holding back and killing investment and actually unleash prosperity. Imagine if, say, instead of reviewing the NDIS legislation and rules, they actually took measures to tackle some of the issues that are already very, very clear in the NDIS, but no one wants to talk about. Imagine if instead of having a review of Southern Basin water markets in the Murray-Darling Basin, they actually did something about it at a time when farmers are going to the wall because so much water has been allocated to the environment. You can actually go through this entire list and think about all the things that they could have just gone ahead and done.
But that's been a Liberal government problem for a while now, where Labor has shorter terms and they're in government for much less time, but while they're there, they actually do things, and then they get kicked out, while the Liberal Party seems to care more about staying in government. But who has a longer impact on policy? I would argue that the Labor Party actually has probably more of an impact on policy than the Liberals, even though we've been in power for 70% of the time.
What can we expect from a Conservative government? What should we want to expect from a Conservative government?
Look, I think it's I would love if a government ticked off all 100 of the IPA's great ideas, and they've made some headroads in doing that. But look, I think the thing to remember is, and this might sound like a bit of a cop-out, but politics is different from what we do here in think tank land. It is slow.
I refuse to believe that.
It is incremental. No. In politics, politics is the art of the possible. We are in the battle of ideas. They are two different things. Politics, if you get 60% of what you want, you are having a great day. You usually get maybe 30% after all the horse trading occurs and everything else. You do need to bring people with you. There are certain sacred cows in this country that can be slaughtered, but it takes some serious footwork.
But the
last time that was done, something deeply unpopular that I can recall, was the GST by John Howard at the 1998 election. I really can't think of anything else that was difficult to sell.
But look,
work choices.
Look, I agree with it. I agree with that.
Howard was blasted out of office by Kevin Rudd of all people.
Yeah, of course.
I
but
agree.
that's the example that's made the Liberals scared.
Yeah.
I agree with that, but they are not just failing to slaughter sacred cows; they're creating new sacred cows. And I look at the top two of their agenda.
For the avoidance of doubt, I was in no way defending the laundry list. I think that list is a bit myopic, a bit unfair, because it does, again, ignore the red tape.
No, but that's sorry. So this is their priority list. So I agree. There are some things. It's like a 10-page document, right?
Yeah.
And there are some things in the back half of the document that are like, oh, I like deregulation too. But this is the things they want to talk about.
Yeah.
And the first thing they want to talk about is the big stick legislation. The second thing they want to talk about is multinational tax, rather
That's just politically stupid. You're not paying to your strengths.
No.
Playing to your strengths.
No, but this is what they think their strengths are.
Yeah, that's just political incompetence, frankly. Yeah.
And also the other list. I mean, where I think that you're defending them too much, Gideon. Seriously, if you go down this list,
I'm a nice guy, Scott.
of the various reviews they've commissioned.
That's what the Turnbull government
in
thought
some
too.
cases where something is genuinely difficult. So, for instance, there's a review into nuclear energy in Australia. Now, I would actually put that in the category of things where the review serves some purpose, because you're trying to open up a debate where there has been no debate,
and it's highly technical.
and you're actually trying to mobilise civil society organisations to step forward and say, why wouldn't you have nuclear energy?
I mean, the other way they could do that is with a sleeping dragon or dragon's den.
Yeah, they can chain themselves to a railway line.
Review or.
As opposed to other areas where they should actually know what they need to do and they should be getting on with it. I mean, even Malcolm Turnbull brought in legislation to remove some of the more onerous provisions of the resources legislation, the things that are allowing third-party litigation, all these sorts of things. Even Malcolm Turnbull bowled that up to the Senate. Couldn't get it through the Senate, but at least he had a crack. Yeah, 487.
I think that was the Abbott government.
No. You're just want to say that everything
No, I
was a
genuinely think
result
that
of the
maybe
Abbott government.
I'm believing my own proverbial.
Okay.
Yeah.
No,
I'm sure. Anyway,
one of them.
So if
I'll
listeners
take that
want to
on
write
notice.
in, that would be really
Pre-Morrison.
helpful.
Yeah.
We need pre-Morrison and post-Morrison. Okay, we'll stand corrected. But that's my point. You can go through this list and say that there are some things. So the retirement income system would be another one where we're in a system where they're saying we're going to have a review of the retirement income system, but where there are no plans to change the forecast rise in the superannuation guarantee to 12%. Now, if you're taking that off the table, what are you doing the review for, Josh? Josh, you're listening. I mean that should be a no-brainer, I think, for the Liberal National Government.
You would have thought so.
You would have thought so. Now, speaking of. No, actually, there is
No
no
brainers.
segue. No, there is no segue. We have reached that point in the show, which is our books and culture segment, where we're each going to share something we've been reading, watching, or listening to. And there's been great excitement this week. Let's lead off with the award of the Nobel Prize in Economics.
Absolutely. In fact, last night, as we're recording this, the Nobel Prize in Economics has been handed to three separate economists, Abhijit Banerjee, Esther Duflo, and Michael Cremer. Banerjee and Duflo are from MIT, and Cremer is from Harvard. The Nobel Prize, what brings them all together, they are experimental-based development economics. So they're using experimental methods to figure out how to, pull people, communities, individuals out of poverty, particularly focused in the third world. So the idea is this: let's say you've got two villages in a very poor country, say a country in Africa. You've got two villages. You would do an intervention. Let's say you would increase resources on literacy or provide fly nets or something like that to one village, and you wouldn't to the other village. Now, if you design these studies properly, and there's enough randomization, and that's why they're called randomized control trials, you'll be able to fairly clearly demonstrate whether an intervention works or not. So rather than going from the sort of top down, we need to give the government of that country foreign aid, and we need to give resources to change their institutions or what have you. This set of economists, this group of economists, have pioneered the idea that we should really focus on micro interventions at the village or household or even individual level. Now, what is the significance of choosing these three as Nobel Prize winners? And this research agenda is Nobel Prize. It reflects what we call the empirical turn in economics. What's interesting about this is there's really no theory or model that informs that research. It's just think of an intervention, find out whether it works. Think of the next intervention, find out whether it works. There's no economic theory. There's no vision about how the world functions. Now, I think they do very, very good work. I wasn't deeply familiar with them before they got the Nobel Prize, but having looked through a number of their papers, they're obviously very worthy winners of the Nobel Prize. My question is, do we know more about how societies function after that work has been done? And I'm not sure that we do. If we think that economics is a distinct field that has things to say about the world, well, we sort of need to. Are we learning how the world works? Are we learning about theory and models and that sort of thing? But look, a really interesting Nobel Prize that sort of tells you the direction that the field is going and some of the traps, in fact, that we could fall into.
I think it's a win for common sense. There is that old gag, of course. No one can quite work out who said it, which is, someone was presented with an outcome and they said, well, that's all very well in practice, but how does it work out in theory?
I love that. I've never heard that one before.
Yeah, no, it's silly. I mean, just speaking of everything that's wrong with university, so.
But there's sort of two. Let me expand a little bit of my critique here. There's two ways to think about the problem of poverty. The first one is we don't have enough mosquito nets, we don't have enough, there's not enough literacy in the developing world. And those are genuine problems, and fixing those problems make significant increases in people's living standards, and we shouldn't be rejecting them. But the reason that those countries don't have enough mosquito nets, the reason that they don't have the education system that we have in Australia or in the developed world, is because of institutional problems, because they might have a corrupt legal system, they might have a dictatorial government, they might have a bureaucracy that requires payments rather than processes. And those are serious institutional problems, and I sort of think that when we should be focusing more energy, certainly in the economics profession, on those problems. We know how countries get rich. We know why countries are rich. It's very hard to get from there to here.
Yeah, and sometimes you've got to experiment with the interventions.
I was supposed to say, surely they're not, sorry to cut you off, Scott, but surely they're not mutually exclusive. I mean, we can encourage institutional reform, and of course we know that a lot of these problems, famines, they're political problems, they're politically caused. But if we are going to give humanitarian relief, I mean, I suppose it makes sense for targeted relief rather than handing over a wad of cash.
And it would be good to know if it worked. That's absolutely right. And that's why I don't want to diminish, it sounds like I'm diminishing, but I don't intend to diminish the importance of this research, because every single person who benefits as an individual or community or household of benefits is better off, and we are better off for having known that. But I think in the long run, the changes that need to be made and are being made in many developing countries they're institutional. Those are really hard to deal with.
Yeah, so I have been going back over books on my bookshelf and came across Pet Sematary, which is actually the first horror book by Stephen King that I ever read. I started reading Stephen King on his non-horror writings as a young child, actually about 10. And the first time I made a dive into his horror books was definitely not the right book to choose. First off, I chose It, which is about 1,000 pages, and it's just a drug-fueled mess. Like, it's just jumps all over the place, and an 11-year-old doesn't really know how to interpret that book. So I kind of went.
Did you finish it?
No. So I didn't. I went, okay, Stephen King horror is not for me. I like his non-horror; they're great. But later in my life, I came to Pet Sematary, which always struck me as it's a bit of an odd title. Doesn't sound that scary. Everyone says it's one of the scariest books ever. And I was like, oh, okay, you pick it up. And pretty much I don't want to give away any endings, but Pet Sematary is pretty much about a fear of death. And it's kind of his musings on the ideas of death and mortality. And the main character is a doctor. And it is actually one of the books most famous for not being finished, because you can, and anyone who's read this book will be able to tell, you can kind of tell where it's going to go from one part of the book, and you either go, I'm along for the ride, or you're just like, nah, I cannot read that. it's not, I don't think I'll be able to deal with it. So I know a lot of people who've gone, yeah, Pet Sematary, it's a great book, but I can't finish it because I knew what was going to happen. But the great thing about King is that you still, if you do continue with the book, even though you do kind of know what's going to happen, it's still a surprise and you're still in there for the suspense.
The title's Pet Sematary, so I presume it ends with a lot of dead animals or something.
No,
Don't spoil it.
Don't spoil it. But I highly recommend
the
Pet
title
Sematary
alone.
as probably a lot of people argue that it's The Shining that is his scariest book, which is more of an exploration of insanity. I would say that I find Pet Sematary scarier.
He does seem to be a writer that known for genre, of course, but gets a lot of respect in literary circles.
Yeah. But he is
people
very
rave
hit
about
and
on
miss.
writing.
And he's also someone who actually, even though people keep attempting to do it, doesn't actually translate that well to film a lot of the time. So Pet Sematary, the movie, came out recently, another remake, and it was terrible.
Speaking of Stephen King adaptations, so there is a new sequel to The Shining coming out the sequel's already been written, but a movie of the sequel to The Shining, Doctor Sleep, coming out in a couple of weeks. So
it definitely is going to suffer from the long shadow that the original Shining film cast.
But it's got Ewan McGregor, and he's pretty good.
For me,
one of the best films
as far
ever.
as Stephen King adaptations go, to me, nothing beats Misery. That is one of the best psychological thrillers of all time.
The original or the Family Guy version was Stewie?
Both. They're both good. So I read recently a book called Money Spinners by Annelise Nielson, who's a journalist at Sky. And it was one of those books you sort of... It's about the Banking Royal Commission, basically. And it was one of those books you sort of pick up at the airport. I thought, well, I hadn't followed the Royal Commission particularly closely, not as close as I should, given what my day job is. But, I knew vaguely things about charging fees to dead people and fees for no service and everything else. But I figured I should probably read up a little bit more. And I quite admire Nielsen as a television journalist, so I thought it'd be a decent read. It was a really, really great piece of literary journalism. For taking something that's quite dry, Nielsen manages to make it engaging and funny and, injecting a bit of humour into it, a bit of gonzo, which, as you know, Scott, is one of my favourite sort of literary subgenres. Yeah. But secondly, the substantive content of it was quite refreshing because it was very different from the usual narrative of greedy banks, free market gone wild. What Nielsen does is she focuses on the issue of financial advice and dodgy financial advice being given, and as opposed to the banks as an amorphous entity and an issue. And she goes right back to the birth of what is a very young industry in the 1980s, and he's quite agnostic about the regulatory issues that have been covered elsewhere. I mean, she does mention, with a lot of points that ASIC, was incompetent, and my personal view is I think that we've created banks that are too big to be regulated through oligopolies and through, ironically, regulation that squeezes out small competitors and all the rest. But no, it was an interesting book, and for anybody who is, again, sort of tangentially aware of the issues but wants a real deep dive into where it all went wrong without reading something that's preachy or that has a foregone conclusion or anything else, definitely recommend this one.
What was your policy takeout, or wasn't it that sort of...
So firstly, as I said, that I think we've created banks that are too big for anybody to regulate. But, I mean, one observation that Nielsen made at one point was that that a lot of this has been driven by the amount of cash that's been floating around because of compulsory superannuation. People have ended up with these huge nest eggs to their name, and they go off to some dodgy bloke who says, I'll maximise the return if you pump it into something that I just so happen to get a big commission from selling to you. Yeah. So I think the macro theme is that these are very, very complex issues. They are very, very
nuanced. They are complex, and you'll be pleased to know that the Morrison government currently has a review underway of arrangements for financial advisors, because that was the one Royal Commission recommendation they couldn't quite stomach.
Review. Yeah.
I had to punt that one down the road. No, that does sound like a good book on a very topical issue, given that the reverberations are still working their way through the industry.
Good choosing, Gideon.
Yeah, well done,
my pleasure.
Gideon. You can come back on the show.
We all have our talents.
Anytime you like. I have a book which I haven't read, but I'm going to talk about anyway because I went to a public lecture last night by the author, and he had slides. So
you do know the thesis.
Yeah, I've got it. I don't need to read it.
It was either convincing or not convincing.
It's called The Wealth Effect: How the Great Expectations of the Middle Class Have Changed the Politics of Banking Crises. This is something of interest to someone, Dr. Berg, who did their PhD on the banking industry.
Yeah, God knows who, but yeah.
So co-authors Jeffrey M. Chwieroth and Andrew Walter, who was the presenter last night. He's actually at the University of Melbourne. And his hypothesis, it's a political economy approach. He's essentially tracked banking crises through the ages, right up to the GFC. And it was very much marketed as being about this explains populism, but I think there's a bit more going on there. And in fact, it's probably the one thing he doesn't do. It's the one part that I would challenge. He made the point that the difference between the Great Depression and, say, the GFC is that in the Great Depression, most people had very few financial assets. So they were very, very interested in whether they got to keep their job. So they were very, very interested in the unemployment rate, somewhat interested in real wages. But so you have these external shocks to the system. And in the years of the Great Depression, in much of the Western world, including Australia, there wasn't necessarily turmoil in the political system that resulted, even though there'd been a massive hit to asset values, because the change in, say, housing prices didn't matter so much because only 20% of people owned houses. Fast forward to the GFC, and what you have is a much greater middle class, which is a good thing, but that also means that much more of their wealth is tied up with housing and with various forms of financial assets, say in Australia, tied up in a super fund. And you have these massive shocks to the system, and this completely changes the dynamic. And he actually tells a story that none of us like crony capitalism, none of us like the bank bailouts, but he was almost like this created a constituency for the governments to throw financial prudence out the window and do whatever they could if it was seen to be saving those assets for the middle class.
You'll be surprised to know I agree 100% with that. So one of the thesis of my thesis was really about all that regulation that's protecting those banks comes from, at its very heart, the belief that if you or I as punters put money into a bank, that's a deposit that is perfectly safe. And there's almost no way to do that unless you have the government back it up in some way, whether implicitly or explicitly. But if the government backs it up, then the banks take risky decisions, so you have to stop them taking risky decisions. And everything flows down from that relationship between how we, as people who hold assets, and even if it's just a bit of money, not under our bed, but in a company, and how that affects all the regulatory frameworks, and it's just getting worse because we're holding more money, we've got more assets.
Yeah, so we keep on making dumber and dumber decisions. The second part of the analysis, which is where I did start to part company, was he had some terrific correlations, which I think established quite reasonably that the greater the shock of the wealth effect, like surveying countries all over the world, the greater the shock of the wealth effect, the more of a populist political outcome you saw. So this is classic political economy. So whether it be Poland or Hungary or in the English-speaking world, it kept on.
Venezuela gets rich suddenly, and everything falls.
Strangely, you don't talk about Venezuela. You talk about Brexit and Trump, and this is where I parted company, because in this room full of people in a lecture theatre at the University of Melbourne, I think I spotted one other guy who might have been also sitting there thinking, "What's wrong with Brexit?" If people are having a populist revolt against this, they've actually got some justification for all this. And I got to talk to Andrew afterwards, and I said, "Well, yeah, but this is a clash of values as well. All the GFC did was actually reveal that clash of values." But it was interesting to see that populist. The populist response, could actually be correlated to the size of the change. But then where it breaks down as an explanation is what populist governments actually do. It's not correlated. It's up to them. It's still a feature of the political process. You can have a Trump, or you can have a Viktor Orban, or you can have Greece, which is all over the shop, or you
can have a Boris Johnson.
Or you can have a Boris Johnson, which is about Brexit, which is just to say we'd like to be our own country, thank you very much, and no one in Brussels is going to help us out of this mess and may have actually had something to do with causing it. But anyway, so that's the wealth effect, how the great expectations of the middle class have changed the politics of banking crises. And maybe I'll buy the book, I don't know. maybe Berg will, I don't know. So that comes to the end of the Books and Culture segment, and indeed the end of looking forward for another week. Thank you for joining us. Thank you to Chris Berg.
Thank you, Scott.
Renee Gorman.
Thank you.
Gideon Rozner.
Thanks, it was fun.
And in the control room, Josh Stranger. We'll be back with more looking forward next week. Thanks.